Rose Harding never asked for a fight. She'd inherited the land with every intention of living quietly, maintaining what her father and grandfather had built long before zoning boards and development contracts started choking the countryside. The ranch wasn't extravagant, but it was vast, and the old stone well nestled between the barn and windbreak was the heart of it all. 100-foot-deep lifeline that had served 3 generations through drought, storms, and years of hard labor. Water flowed clean and steady, no chemicals, no meters, no dependency. That kind of independence, once taken for granted, had become rare, even suspect, in a world where everything was supposed to be interconnected, regulated, and taxable. When Rose returned to the property after 15 years of working in pharmaceutical crop cultivation across the Midwest, she knew what she was reclaiming, a place where she answered to no one but the land itself. The house needed fixing. The fencing was half down, and the pump system for the well had to be manually restarted every morning, but she loved the rawness of it all. The wind still howled through the trees the same way it had when she was a girl. The soil still held that iron scent after rain. There was a rhythm to the ranch, and after years of travel and sterile lab contracts, Rose felt her bones align again with something real. A month after moving in, she received the first envelope. It was cream-colored, stiff paper, addressed in neat black ink. There was no logo, just a name: Karen Fletcher. Rose opened it on the porch with the morning coffee still steaming beside her boot. The letter inside was as politely menacing as it was absurd. It welcomed her to the neighborhood. A neighborhood, she noted, that was several miles and 2 barbed wire gates away, and invited her to a meeting regarding a proposed integration of her property into the surrounding water district. There was no demand, no threats, just a suggestion. A smile hidden in the phrasing. It's in everyone's best interest to operate under a shared system, especially given the drought conditions projected this season. Rose didn't answer. She tossed the letter in the burn barrel out back and went on with her day. She didn't need anyone's pipes or contracts. The well hadn't failed her in 60 years. It wasn't about to now. Over the following weeks, she received more letters, each one more formal than the last, each bearing the same signature: Karen Fletcher, President, Regional Utility Oversight Council. It was a mouthful of a title, one she didn't recognize as elected or even legally binding. She ignored them all. The first time she met Karen in person, it was on the side of the access road leading up to her property. Rose had been hauling fencing materials in the back of her truck when she saw a black SUV parked awkwardly in the gravel turn-in blocking her path. The woman who stepped out looked entirely out of place in the dust and wind. Tailored khakis, white blouse, pearl earrings. She didn't smile. "Miss Harding?" she asked, her voice flat, as if they were at a boardroom negotiation and not a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. "I've been trying to reach you. I believe we have some unresolved concerns about water use and shared resource agreements." Rose leaned against the tailgate and squinted. "I didn't sign any agreements. I've got my own water." Karen's eyes tightened, just enough to show the irritation behind the veneer. "I understand your independence." "I do. But your land is situated on a key point in the groundwater table. We've already been approved for expansion. All we need is your cooperation to make the integration smooth. You can dig somewhere else." Karen's tone cooled. "We have maps, hydrological surveys. The city understands that water is a shared resource now, not a personal possession. Refusing to participate only delays the inevitable and forces the council into more formal procedures." Rose didn't raise her voice. She just stepped forward, enough that Karen instinctively took a half step back. "If anyone steps foot on my land with a drill, pipe, or clipboard, they'll leave in worse shape than they came." For a moment, silence. Then Karen nodded, too smoothly. "You'll regret being uncooperative. Not today, but you will." That night Rose couldn't sleep. not out of fear, but out of a gnawing discomfort. Something in Karen's eyes wasn't about bureaucracy. It was about control. There was a smug certainty that didn't belong to someone who was bluffing. 2 weeks passed without incident. Rose spent her mornings tending to the field behind the barn where she'd started cultivating a new strain of medicinal valerian under contract with a Colorado lab. The system was simple. Gravity-fed irrigation from a series of barrels filled by the well. The pump groaned with age, but it worked. It always had. On Sundays, she drove into town for supplies and kept mostly to herself. Locals knew her name, her family history, and they respected the land she held. She was starting to believe the threat had passed, until the morning she found the concrete. It wasn't subtle. The earth around the well was torn and compacted with heavy tracks. The wooden cover had been ripped off and tossed aside like scrap. The pipe casing was visible, but only just. It was half submerged in a thick gray column of industrial cement, still streaked where it had dried overnight. The pump system was gone, disconnected. The power cables cut, ends curled and blackened. Whoever had done it hadn't rushed. They'd been methodical. Rose didn't scream. She stood there in the wind, staring down at the violation of everything the land meant to her, and didn't move for a long time. She called the sheriff first. He came out an hour later, young and sympathetic, but already apologizing before he'd stepped out of the cruiser. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no clear suspects, no proof. "We can file a report, ma'am," he said, adjusting his belt. "But without evidence, there's not much we can do. You might want to consider working with the district moving forward. They've got resources, protection." "I don't want their protection," Rose said. "Then I'm sorry." By sunset, word had spread. Oh, not to neighbors. They wouldn't hear it for weeks, if ever, but to the people who'd been waiting for a response. Karen didn't show up, but a letter did, placed carefully in Rose's mailbox the next morning. It was shorter than the others. "We regret that personal resistance has led to disruption. Should you wish to discuss terms of property acquisition or shared access, our office remains open." Rose burned it without reading the rest. The well was ruined. Repair would take months, possibly longer, drilling a new shaft, rewiring systems, sourcing permits. She didn't have months. The crops would die. Her contract would fail. Everything she'd worked to build since returning would collapse. And that, she realized with sudden clarity, was the point. They didn't want the land as it was. They wanted it when she was gone. She stood in the barn that night, surrounded by silence and dust, and decided something she hadn't even known she'd been resisting. She wasn't going to ask for help. She was going to act. But not rashly, not with threats. She would answer this violation in the only way the system understood, with a counterstroke that hurt them. If they believed they could take her water, then they'd better be ready to lose their own. And when they came looking for reasons, when the council called emergency meetings and the utility board scrambled to explain why the pipeline authorization had been pulled, it wouldn't be her name on any complaint. It would be their own signatures, turned against them. Rose didn't panic. That was the first thing she made sure of. There was too much to do, too much to account for, and she knew panic had never fixed anything. Instead, she pulled out the heavy-duty tarp from the barn, covered the ruined wellhead to protect what little access remained, and began making calls. Not frantic ones, not to friends or family, but to professionals who could tell her the truth about what had happened. She didn't expect miracles, but she wanted data. 2 days later, a private hydrologist arrived on the property. He was ex-military, blunt, and meticulous, and he didn't offer hollow condolences. What he did offer was a grim summary. The sabotage was professional. The cement wasn't the kind you'd find at a hardware store. It was high-density structural mix, poured deep and fast. The casing had been drilled open at an angle first, suggesting precision tools. Whoever had done this didn't want to disable the well temporarily. They wanted it dead. Rose paid him in cash, thanked him, and said nothing about the council. She didn't need to. He'd seen this before, or something like it. As he loaded his equipment back into his truck, he muttered, "If you've got enemies with utility contracts, I'd lawyer up. Fast." Rose nodded but didn't answer. She already had. By the end of the week, she was sitting across from her attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Felicia McKenna, who had handled land disputes for ranchers and farmers for over 20 years. She didn't blink when Rose described the sabotage. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and began asking questions about access rights, aquifer mapping, city expansion permits, and the last known copy of Rose's property plat. When Rose handed over the documents her father had kept locked away in a metal box under the floorboards, deeds, well permits, and the original 1963 groundwater rights certificate, Felicia's eyebrows rose. "You're sitting on gold," she said, "and someone knows it." That same afternoon, Felicia filed 2 formal motions. The first was a cease and desist order sent to the City Council's Utility Extension Office, demanding a halt on any current or planned infrastructure projects adjacent to Rose's land pending review of unlawful water diversion or unauthorized dependency inclusion. The second was a notification of pending litigation, citing property sabotage, economic interference, and fraudulent use of private aquifer mapping. Both filings were delivered by courier and signed for by someone in the council's legal department. Rose made sure of that. But paperwork alone wasn't going to fix the land, and every day that passed without water was another blow to her field. The valerian crops were wilting. She'd tried hauling in tanks of water herself, but it wasn't sustainable, and she knew it. The contract with the Colorado biotech firm had delivery deadlines. 1 missed shipment meant penalties. 2 meant termination. They'd been generous, agreeing to work with a rural grower who operated outside the standard irrigation network, but their patience wouldn't be infinite. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen. A white pickup truck appeared near the back fence one morning, parked on a maintenance easement that hadn't been used in years. No logo, no plates. Rose stepped outside with her phone and pretended to take a photo. The truck drove off. 2 days later, she found tire tracks crossing through the lower pasture, even though the gate had been locked. Her mailbox was open one morning, the flag up, but no mail inside. A water meter, one that had never existed before, was found installed near the edge of her property line, half buried under dirt and wired into an electrical conduit she didn't recognize. She took photos, logged the GPS coordinates, and sent them directly to Felicia. The lawyer called her back that evening with a controlled urgency in her voice. "They're staging for a reclassification," she said. "If they can make it look like you've already been integrated into the shared system, they can rewrite the legal narrative. It's not about proving what's real. It's about documenting what looks real enough on paper. They want to flip the burden of proof onto you." Rose didn't answer for a long moment. She knew the tactic. Bureaucracy could bury a person deeper than cement ever could. Felicia wasn't done. "I pulled the city's public works filings. A month ago, they submitted a water expansion schematic to the State Utility Commission, and your land is in it. Not as an acquisition, as an existing support zone. That's how they're justifying their pipe work, by pretending you're already part of their grid, and someone forged your signature on the consent form." Rose exhaled slowly. "Can we prove that?" "We can," Felicia said. "But proving it isn't enough. We need to stop them before they get state approval. Once that happens, you won't be fighting for your land. You'll be fighting for the right to say no." The next day, Rose drove to the Regional Water District headquarters. She didn't go in yelling or demanding answers. Instead, she asked to see the supervisor of infrastructure development. The receptionist gave her a look but called someone up. 15 minutes later, a man in a pressed shirt with a clipboard met her in the lobby. His name was Bennett, and he smiled like he already knew she was trouble. "Miss Harding, you don't need to worry," he said. "Your area's part of the optimization project. It's going to make everyone's water bills a lot more manageable, and we've made every effort to ensure environmental compliance." "I didn't sign anything," she said. "There's a signed authorization on file." "I want to see it." Bennett's smile didn't falter, but it thinned. "We don't release internal documents without a formal request through legal channels." Rose stepped closer. Then expect one." By the time she got home, Felicia had already filed a motion demanding full disclosure of any documentation the city used to justify infrastructural development on or through her property. She also filed an emergency request with the State Utility Commission to freeze any pending contract approvals related to the disputed expansion zone. That night, a message from the biotech company pinged her inbox. It was curt and corporate. "We've been informed of a possible disruption in your irrigation network. Please confirm expected resolution within 48 hours or risk contract suspension." She sat for a long time in front of the computer, staring at those words. The plan was working. Not hers. Theirs. The sabotage, the fake meters, the forged forms, each was a stroke in a slow, quiet campaign not just to pressure her into compliance, but to make her irrelevant. If they could erode her operations, break her contracts, isolate her legally, then by the time she fought her way through the courts, there'd be nothing left to fight for. But Rose didn't believe in slow defeat. She believed in decisive reversals. And somewhere in the thousands of pages of contracts and permits signed over the past 6 months by the District Council and the Water Board, there was going to be a vulnerability, a procedural oversight, a conflict of interest, a misstep so technical and buried that they'd never expect anyone to find it, let alone use it against them. She wasn't going to wait for justice. She was going to force their hand. The first sign that things had moved from quiet manipulation to open pressure came not in a courtroom or board meeting, but in the sudden arrival of a maintenance crew on Rose's eastern boundary line. It was early morning, the sky still pale with dew, when she heard the rumble of diesel engines outside her bedroom window. She dressed in silence, boots pulling on with the calm of someone who had already been expecting something worse. When she stepped onto the porch, 3 utility trucks were lined up along the easement path, their hazard lights blinking steadily as the workers in reflective vests milled around, unloading spools of tubing and long, narrow trenching equipment. A man with a clipboard noticed her approach and gave a small, calculated wave. "Just confirming the staging zone for the water extension line," he said as if reading a weather report. "You're not on the affected grid, but this route runs along the approved easement. Should be minimal disruption." Rose didn't answer at first. She stepped down onto the gravel and walked directly past him toward the nearest marker flag, bright orange plastic sticking out of the earth like a foreign object in her soil. She plucked it from the ground, stared at the code printed on the shaft, and looked back toward the man. "You're working off illegal documents," she said. "There is no authorized easement extension here. Your approval is based on a fraudulent expansion map that includes a forged signature." He didn't blink. "Ma'am, we're just following the city's directive." "Then get them on the phone." The man looked mildly amused, but to his credit, he pulled out a radio and began muttering into it. Rose didn't wait. She walked straight back to her house, pulled up the contact sheet Felicia had compiled, and dialed the number for the regional utility ombudsman. A woman answered too quickly, and Rose could already hear the rehearsed indifference in her tone. "I need to issue an immediate complaint," Rose said flatly. "Unauthorized construction activity is occurring on private land under the false pretense of municipal expansion. I've filed motions, and there's a pending injunction. If you don't halt this now, you'll be named in the suit as a party ignoring legal notification." There was a pause, long enough for something to shift. Then the woman said she would notify the appropriate department. 40 minutes later, the trucks were gone. That should have been the end of it, or at least a pause. But that same afternoon, Rose received a certified letter delivered by hand. Not by post, but by a uniformed man who simply nodded and walked away after she signed for it. Inside the envelope was a formal notification from the city's Environmental Resource Department, stating that her property was now subject to an emergency review due to suspected ecological misuse. Soil disruption, unregulated water diversion, and unauthorized containment systems were cited, with a scheduled inspection date already set for the following week. She brought the letter to Felicia the next day, her hands steady despite the fury building in her chest. The lawyer read it through twice and exhaled slowly. They're playing dirty now. This isn't about winning through infrastructure. They're going to bury you in violations, stack them until you can't afford to stay afloat. Even if we prove it's retaliatory, they'll argue it was procedural. And they know what they're doing. Those inspections come with penalties attached. The longer they drag out, the more pressure you're under to settle. Rose looked at the window of Felicia's office. Across the street, the courthouse loomed like a tired, overused weapon. Then we don't give them the delay they want. Can we get an independent survey? I already filed the request this morning, Felicia said, and I've contacted a licensed hydrology firm. They'll certify the property's compliance before the city can manipulate their findings. I also sent discovery motions to the department's internal review board, so any communication about you will have to be disclosed. That night, as Rose walked the property, flashlight in hand, she found the chain on the back gate had been cut. It was a clean slice. Bolt cutters, not weather. Nothing appeared stolen, but a plastic flag identical to the one she'd removed earlier was tucked just inside the gate, half buried in dirt. Someone had been on her land. Not to damage, not this time. Just to remind her they could. The following day, her tractor wouldn't start. She checked the fuel tank. Full. Battery was fine. But the starter relay had been yanked and left hanging, the wires exposed and clipped. It was precise work, not vandalism. It was someone who knew what they were doing. She didn't report it. She logged it. Every incident now went into a private ledger. Time, date, details, photographs. It wasn't just for evidence. It was for herself. A reminder that this wasn't paranoia. It was strategy. The final blow that week wasn't loud. It came in the form of an email from the biotech company. Due to failure to meet preliminary yield targets and ongoing logistical uncertainty, we are placing your account on review. Please be advised this is not a termination notice. Final decision will be communicated in 7 business days. Rose stared at the screen. Her stomach felt hollow. The letter wasn't a surprise. She had watched the plants wilt, counted the dry days, but it felt like a door closing. She didn't reply. She simply rose from her chair, walked outside into the dust and the dying light, and sat on the edge of the porch, elbows on her knees. It wasn't defeat she felt. It was silence, like the moment before a weather front breaks. The world was still, but every instinct told her this wasn't the bottom. It was the ledge just above it, and the real drop was coming. Felicia called that night with an update. The survey team had completed a preliminary scan and found something interesting. A narrow auxiliary pipe, less than 3 inches in diameter, running from a manhole cover on the adjacent access road straight toward the section of Rose's property that once housed the wellhead. It had been bored underground, likely with directional drilling equipment, and it terminated just beneath her southern pasture, almost beneath the roots of her irrigation system. It was hidden, illegal, and most importantly, it was recent. This isn't just about expansion, Felicia said. They were already using your land. That pipe might have been installed before you moved back in. They weren't planning to ask. They were planning to take, use, and bury the evidence. The sabotage was their cleanup plan. You reactivated a system they'd quietly depended on, and they couldn't afford to let you claim it. Rose didn't answer immediately. She felt cold, but clear. What do we do? We report the pipe. We force an inspection. If we prove they've been siphoning without disclosure, the entire contract with the city becomes vulnerable. Water use violations of that kind are breach of utility regulation, not civil, criminal. And the inspection? They'll stall. So we report it to the state. The next morning, before the sun had burned off the fog, Rose walked out to the edge of her field where the ground was damp in a way it shouldn't have been. The pasture had been dry for a week, yet here, near the termination point of that hidden pipe, the earth was soft. She crouched, dug down with her gloved hands, and felt the cool metal not more than a foot below the surface. She didn't speak. She didn't call. She placed a wooden marker in the dirt, stepped back, and took the photo that would go with Felicia's next filing. By noon, the paperwork was in motion. By evening, the Regional Water District's Emergency Council had sent a formal inquiry request, and the first real crack appeared in the enemy's wall. Not a collapse, not yet. But a fissure, one that could widen, if struck just right. Rose didn't believe in revenge. She believed in reclamation. And she wasn't finished yet. The days that followed moved like a pendulum, a back-and-forth swing between slow bureaucratic pushback and quiet legal maneuvering. Every piece of paper filed by Rose and Felicia seemed to force a measured counter-response from the city and the water board, but nothing direct. No one admitted fault. No one denied anything outright. They shifted language. They referred to procedural ambiguities, provisional designations, terms that could be interpreted differently depending on who was reading. Yet the effect was clear. The expansion project was slowing. Equipment that had been staged near Rose's land was withdrawn. Timelines were postponed, and language in press releases changed from integration to ongoing review. But with every inch of ground Rose regained, she knew the pressure was simply moving elsewhere, unseen, not dissipated. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were adjusting. The inspection of the unauthorized pipe finally happened after Felicia escalated the matter to the state's Office of Environmental Accountability. A neutral compliance team was dispatched from Austin, 2 engineers and an observer from a third-party firm. They arrived without announcement on a Tuesday morning, carrying clipboards, a ground radar unit, and a quiet, businesslike manner that Rose appreciated more than she expected. There was no posturing, no small talk. They measured the depth and angle of the auxiliary pipe, confirmed its recent installation, and documented that it terminated in active soil beneath Rose's private irrigation zone, an area that had never been listed on any municipal schematics. By noon, they were gone. By Thursday, a formal statement was issued. Potential unauthorized infrastructure detected intersecting non-participant agricultural property. Further analysis required. The phrase was dry, legalistic, and damning. That night, Felicia called with something else. "I have what we needed," she said. "A copy of the contract between the district and the city. It's worse than we thought. They didn't just forge your consent. They submitted your parcel as a conditional support site, stating it was previously tapped for emergency use during the last drought. That false history is what secured their permit from the city's infrastructure board. They fabricated operational records." Rose's silence on the line stretched for several seconds before she said, "And the state?" "They haven't seen this yet, but once they do, the contract becomes legally unstable. And if we can prove material fraud in the permit process, we can freeze the district's access to state water subsidies. That's their real lifeline, not the water itself, but the money that keeps it flowing." Rose felt the weight of that knowledge settle in her chest. For the first time since the cement had choked her well, the balance of power had shifted. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She had leverage. She could hit back, not through vengeance or anger, but through precision. The next move came quietly, as she had anticipated it would. A letter from the district arrived, phrased as a mediation offer, proposing a formal settlement. The wording was careful. They acknowledged mutual miscommunication and accidental procedural overlap, and offered to compensate Rose with a modest land use stipend in exchange for allowing limited shared access to her property for hydrological monitoring. The tone was conciliatory, even respectful, but Rose saw it for what it was: a purchase offer dressed in compromise. They were trying to pay her off just enough to make the complaints go away without admitting guilt. Felicia advised a hard decline. If you take their money, even once, you validate the premise that this was all just a misunderstanding, and then the records become harder to challenge because you're a participating entity. Rose agreed, but the decision wasn't simple. Her field was dying. Her bank account was draining. Equipment repairs loomed. The contract with the biotech firm had not yet been fully severed, but they were no longer returning calls. Every passing day nudged her closer to a financial cliff. She was fighting a war on paper while reality tried to gut her quietly. Still, she refused. Instead of taking the offer, she made a move of her own. She filed for temporary designation as an independent water utility provider under a little-used state agricultural provision that allowed rural producers to register for non-commercial, self-managed water operations, a classification that came with unique legal protections. It wasn't a license to sell water. It was a status that removed her land from all municipal contracts until future adjudication. The process was complex, invasive, and designed to deter casual applicants, but Felicia walked her through it line by line. 2 weeks later, she received a single-page confirmation. Status approved pending formal review. What it meant, in effect, was that Rose had taken her land, and every pipe beneath it, out of their legal framework. If they moved forward now, they would be building infrastructure across territory explicitly defined as sovereign, operationally distinct, and outside any grid-based water plan. Any pressure now would be not just inappropriate, it would be illegal. It was then, finally, that the calls stopped. The flags vanished. No more trucks parked near her gates. The silence that followed felt almost wrong, like a room too quiet after a shouting match. She knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. They'd invested too much, and public reversal would carry consequences they wouldn't want to face. But something had cracked. Somewhere, someone had seen the report, the inspection log, the status confirmation, and understood that the equation had changed. Rose Harding was no longer a problem to be absorbed. She was a variable they couldn't calculate anymore, but even in that silence, she knew better than to relax. Power didn't retreat, it circled, and the next strike, when it came, wouldn't arrive on legal letterhead. It would come from somewhere she hadn't yet considered. There was a quietness to victory when it came cloaked in paperwork. No cheering, no triumphant headlines. Just an email from the State Commission confirming a hold on the district's water expansion permit and the removal of Rose's property from all active infrastructure plans pending further investigation. It should have felt like a win, and it did. Briefly. But that feeling didn't last. It was replaced almost immediately by a colder realization. They weren't finished. What the council and its allies had lost in official channels, they would now try to reclaim elsewhere, not by argument or negotiation, but through attrition. It began with the cattle. Rose only kept 10 head, mostly for grass control and tax classification, but they were important to her in a way she couldn't easily explain. Their routines gave structure to her days, and she knew them the way most people knew their neighbors. She noticed immediately when 2 of them began showing signs of dehydration. The stock tank wasn't low. The lines from the holding barrel hadn't been touched, but the water had a strange film on it, an oily sheen that caught the light in a way no mineral deposit ever had. She called the local extension office, which sent a technician to take samples. 2 days later, the lab report came back. Trace amounts of methyl tert-butyl ether, a gasoline additive, present in the tank. Not enough to kill, but enough to make the water unsafe. There was no evidence of how it got there. No broken locks, no disturbed fencing. Nothing except a new reality. Someone had poisoned her water system. Not the well this time. What remained of it was sealed and unused, but her backup supply. The last thing sustaining her animals and what few remaining crops hadn't withered in the heat. It was not just a message. It was a promise. If she would not fold under legal pressure, they would find other ways to force her hand. Felicia was furious when Rose told her. "This moves us out of civil conflict and into criminal exposure," she said. Sabotage, contamination, malicious mischief. There are statutes. I can file another complaint, but you need to start documenting every single incident like you're building a federal case." Rose already had been. Her ledger now contained 3 months of detailed entries, supported by photos, maps, timestamps, and third-party confirmations. She knew it wouldn't be enough to convict anyone, not yet, but it painted a picture, one she intended to deliver to anyone who might listen. The next phase came quicker. On a Tuesday morning, the road into her property was blocked. Not barricaded, not cordoned off, just occupied. A roadwork crew had parked 3 trucks diagonally across the gravel path, claiming emergency grading was being performed. No notice had been given. When Rose asked who'd authorized the work, the foreman just shrugged. "Routine maintenance," he said. "We're on the county schedule." Rose called the county office. No such maintenance had been ordered. She didn't confront the crew again. She drove back to town, met with Felicia in person, and together they filed a notice of obstruction and interference, demanding a cease on all unauthorized county-affiliated work within 500 feet of her boundary line. They also lodged a formal accusation of targeted harassment through indirect infrastructure manipulation, a rare but real category of civic abuse. The response from the county was muted but sufficient. The trucks disappeared the next day, and a short letter arrived by mail stating the incident had been a clerical misassignment. No one believed it, but it was enough to get the pressure off for the moment. Then came the drone. It arrived at dusk, low and almost silent, hovering just above her northern field where she'd started planting a trial bed of drought-resistant herbs. It didn't land. It didn't carry anything obvious. It just moved back and forth, a slow grid pattern, until Rose stepped out with her camera and aimed it directly at the blinking lights. The drone pulled upward and vanished to the west. The next night, another came. This time, she didn't take photos. She took the shotgun from the wall. Felicia cautioned her against firing. "I understand the impulse," she said, "but if they're baiting you into a use-of-force situation, they'll use it to paint you as unstable. You've made too much progress. Don't give them an excuse to reset the board." Rose lowered the gun, but she didn't sleep that night. The lights in her house stayed on until sunrise, and she sat by the front window, coffee growing cold beside her, waiting to see if the drone would return. It didn't, but the next morning someone filed a noise complaint against her property, an anonymous tip about excessive generator activity and illegal water pumping. 2 inspectors arrived from the local environmental review office, armed with clipboards and polite smiles. They claimed to have received credible concerns and asked for permission to enter. Rose refused. They left quietly, but she knew it wouldn't end there. What Felicia uncovered next was a stroke of luck and possibly the opening they had been waiting for. One of the state's junior auditing officers had flagged the district's water contract for inconsistency. A series of internal communications had surfaced through a separate case involving land allocation fraud in another county, and in those documents, Felicia found a reference to Rose's parcel listed not as a shared resource, but as Under negotiation. The phrase meant little legally, but contextually it was damning. The council had claimed integration had already occurred. Yet here, in their own documents, they admitted the opposite. It was evidence of dual narrative. One told to the city to gain permits, and another told internally to manage resistance. Felicia sent the findings to the State Water Authority along with a compiled summary of Rose's ordeal. The report was over 90 pages long, dense with cross-references, sworn statements, lab results, and annotated photographs. It was not an accusation. It was a case file, one that could no longer be ignored. 3 days later, the news broke. The state announced a temporary suspension of the district's contract pending review. Funds were frozen. Ongoing projects halted. Emergency meetings were scheduled. The official explanation was procedural, but local rumors spread fast. Rose's name was mentioned, not with blame, but with curiosity. The woman on the ranch, the one who said no. The one who fought back. That night, Rose received one final visitor, Karen Fletcher. The knock came after sunset. Rose opened the door slowly, shotgun not in her hands but not far away either. Karen stood alone. No clipboard, no SUV, just a leather purse and that same cold composure she'd had the first day they met. "You think this is a win?" Karen said without preamble. "You've delayed what's coming, that's all. People like you, who cling to old dirt and dying wells, always think you're defending something. But you're just getting in the way." Rose didn't speak. She watched the woman carefully. Karen's voice dropped. "They'll pull your status. They'll find a way. And when your land is worthless and your fields dry up, the same people cheering for you now will forget you existed. There's always another utility, another plan. You've just made yourself a speed bump." Rose stepped forward, just enough that Karen took a single step back. "If I'm a speed bump," Rose said quietly, "then you're the one skidding. And the state just noticed." Karen didn't respond. She turned, walked back to the road, and disappeared into the dark. It was not an ending, but it was a reckoning. And Rose was far from finished. In the week that followed the suspension of the district's contract, the air around Rose's property thickened with the kind of tension that couldn't be seen but was impossible to ignore. The attacks stopped, but the silence they left behind felt unnatural, calculated, like a held breath. Rose didn't trust it. No one sent drones, poisoned water, and staged fake inspections just to walk away when a contract hit a snag. This wasn't retreat, it was repositioning. And she could feel it, like the shift in wind before a storm. Felicia worked around the clock, filing notices to prevent any backdoor maneuvering while the state investigation unfolded. The Water Board, now under scrutiny, issued formal statements of non-involvement, distancing themselves from the council's internal documentation. One member resigned quietly. Another was placed on temporary administrative leave. The walls were closing in, but no one on the inside wanted to be the first to admit guilt. It was a slow crumbling, and Rose knew the final push would have to come from her side. She spent her evenings walking the property, inspecting every inch of fence line, checking the new water filters she'd installed, tightening bolts on the livestock tanks. Routine helped keep her grounded, but her mind stayed ahead, scanning for the inevitable blow. It arrived not in the form of sabotage or confrontation, but through a legal motion, one that came directly from the Regional Development Committee. It was a request for eminent domain review. They were seeking to declare her land as a critical utility zone under emergency drought relief protocols, and thus subject to forced acquisition if negotiations failed. The irony would have been laughable if the implications weren't so serious. They couldn't win by corruption, so now they would try through law. And worse, they'd framed it as a humanitarian need. Felicia called her the moment the notice arrived in her inbox. "They're desperate," she said. But that doesn't mean this isn't dangerous. The statute they're using hasn't been triggered in 20 years. But if the governor's office sides with them, it won't matter how strong our case is. The land could be seized temporarily while the legal fight plays out. Rose's voice was calm, so we hit back harder. I'm already on it. I pulled the internal water usage reports the district submitted for the last quarter. They inflated their population metrics and listed non-existent infrastructure. It's fraud, again, and it directly impacts their claim of emergency. We'll use it to discredit the review. The case moved quickly. Too quickly. Within 48 hours, a preliminary hearing was scheduled. It was to be held in a satellite court typically used for zoning disputes, far from the public eye. Rose attended with Felicia at her side, dressed plainly but deliberately. No media, no supporters, no spectacle. Just the two of them facing down a table of officials who had clearly expected her to either fold or not show at all. Felicia's argument was brutal in its precision. She laid out the history of harassment, the illegal construction, the sabotage, and the fake documents. She cited not just local violations, but federal-level misrepresentations in utility filings. Then she presented the final blow. A certified report from a whistleblower inside the water district, obtained through a quiet agreement and submitted anonymously, which confirmed that Rose's land had been listed as unauthorized extraction zone, pending neutralization months before the cement attack. The courtroom didn't erupt. It simply stopped. The opposing counsel stumbled through a rebuttal, but the damage had been done. The judge delayed any ruling, stating the claim now required formal review by multiple agencies before any eminent domain decision could proceed. Felicia turned to Rose afterward, her expression unreadable. "This might have been the final move," she said softly. "They don't have anywhere left to hide." Back home, the weight of it all pressed in. Rose had expected resistance, but she hadn't known how deeply it would embed itself into her sleep, her appetite, her trust in the world around her. The ranch had once been a place of solitude and rhythm. Now it felt like a battlefield in retreat. But she reminded herself that all they had thrown at her, the intimidation, the sabotage, the legal games, had not pushed her off. She was still here, and that mattered. The next morning, a letter arrived from the state's Public Utility Commission. It confirmed a full-scale audit of the regional water district and froze all current expansion and acquisition activities indefinitely. It also named 3 individuals for investigation under administrative misconduct, including Karen Fletcher. There were no flourishes, no dramatic headlines, just the cold efficiency of process finally catching up. That afternoon, Rose stood at the center of her field, boots in the dirt, and stared out at the horizon. The soil was dry, but not dead. There was still time to restore it, still time to plant something that could take root again. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't go quietly, and systems that protected such behavior didn't collapse after one investigation. But momentum had shifted. And for the first time in months, Rose wasn't reacting. She was in control, and somewhere deep below, beneath the sabotage and concrete, her land still held water. They couldn't take that. Not anymore. The land didn't change overnight. The sun still burned the mornings dry, and the wind still rolled over the grass with the same disinterested force it always had. But something in the air had shifted, something deeper than temperature or weather. It was a kind of stillness, not of surrender, but of settled ground, the kind that comes after a long battle when both sides know what they've lost and what they'll never get back. Rose didn't expect victory to feel triumphant, and it didn't. What it felt like was restoration, not a return to innocence, that was long gone, but a return to something honest. She had not gained anything new. What she had done was reclaim what was already hers. The state audit unfolded slowly but deliberately, like roots digging into old soil. The water district's expansion plan was officially decertified, and an interim oversight committee took control of its contracts. Karen Fletcher's name no longer appeared on memos. She had resigned without statement, her silence louder than any defense she might have made. Rose didn't hear about it until a clerk at the county office mentioned it in passing while handing her a packet of soil conservation forms. "That woman's gone, you know," the clerk said, her voice tinged with something close to awe. "The one that kept sending out those surveys and reports. She's just gone." Rose nodded and didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Her utility status remained intact. After a follow-up inspection and an updated declaration of self-sufficiency, she was formally recognized as a private, non-commercial agricultural water provider. That meant no one could build on her lines, no one could tap her aquifer, and no one could map her flow patterns without consent. Her land was her own, not in sentiment or tradition, but in law. It was an outcome more powerful than any symbolic victory. It was binding, permanent. But even with the legal war behind her, the work remained. The fields were tired, scarred by months of interrupted cycles and silent aggression. The herb beds had to be restarted from seed. The livestock needed medical checks and dietary correction after weeks of inconsistent hydration. The fencing had to be rebuilt by hand, one post at a time. It wasn't glamorous. There were no press releases, no celebratory banners. Just labor. But for Rose, that was the reward. The rhythm of rebuilding wasn't a burden. It was an act of reclamation. And she didn't do it alone. One by one, neighbors who had stayed silent during the chaos began to emerge. Some came with tools, others with advice. A retired hydrologist from the next town over offered to help her rebuild her water monitoring system. A mechanic she'd gone to school with sent over a refurbished pump motor. Even the seed company that had previously withdrawn its support sent a letter. Not an apology, but a quiet offer to reinitiate the contract under more flexible terms. Rose didn't hold grudges, but she didn't forget either. She agreed on her terms, and only those. Months later, a thin green line began to sprout across the back pasture, stubborn and slow, but unmistakably alive. The land hadn't given up. Neither had she. There was something powerful in that, in knowing that a place, like a person, could be pushed, threatened, nearly broken, but still return to itself when the pressure lifted. On a warm afternoon near the end of the season, Rose stood by the edge of the repaired wellhead. It wasn't the same structure her grandfather had built, but it drew from the same water, deep, ancient, and patient. She rested a hand on the new steel casing and listened. Not for sound, but for presence. The hum of the pump. The resistance of stone. The pulse of something old and enduring. They had tried to silence that. They'd filled it with cement, then lies, then intimidation. But it was still here, and so was she. She didn't need to announce that she'd won. The land said it for her.